Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we grab a stack of sources, really dig into them, and pull out the key knowledge and insights for you.
Exactly. We do the sifting so you get the essential intelligence, those sort of surprising facts and connections that, give you those aha moments.
Absolutely.
No.
And today, well, we're diving deep into a really foundational and honestly, in many ways, quite a tragic story. It's about one specific orca. You've definitely heard her name. It's become like synonymous with something huge, but maybe you don't know her actual story.
And for this one, we're working with excerpts from the OrcaPod Wiki and the Killer Whale Wiki. These are, great resources that compile a lot of data on individual whales and the history of captivity.
Right. So our mission today, uncover the life story, the ultimate fate, and this surprisingly complex legacy of the orca known as the original Shamu. We're pulling the most crucial bits from just these two sources to get that clear picture.
Yeah, get ready, because this dive is into the life of the actual whale behind, well, arguably the most famous orca name in the world. And as we'll see, her pretty short life had this huge impact on an entire industry.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it. So, starting right at the beginning, based on what these sources tell us, the original Shamu, she was a female southern resident killer whale, born into J-Pod, probably around 1961.
Wow, so she was only about, 4 years old when everything changed? Thinking about her early life, as the sources suggest, it would have been completely family-centered.
Absolutely.
Eating Chinook salmon primarily.
Yeah.
Part of those big summer superpod gatherings of the southern residents. Just a totally different world.
A world away, exactly. So the pursuit that led to her capture, it started with a guy named Ted Griffin. He owned an aquarium in Seattle.
Right, the Seattle Marine Aquarium.
Yeah, and he was actively looking for killer whales. He had already acquired a male named Namu back in June '65. Namu had gotten tangled in fishing gear, so Griffin bought him.
And after Namu, the sources say Griffin was, pretty determined to get another whale. He tried for a while, apparently without much luck, until late October 1965.
That's the key date. That's when Shamu and her mother were spotted together in Puget Sound. The capture itself. Halloween. October 31st, 1965, in Henderson Bay, Washington. Griffin's team saw them there.
The details described in the sources about the chase, they're pretty intense, aren't they?
They really are. Shamu's mother was actually hit with a light harpoon, one with a floater buoy attached so they could track her. And they were pursued for, get this, over 17 hours, even used lights to keep track of them after dark.
Wow.
And they were finally netted by two purse signers, the Chinook and the Golden Gate, in Henderson Bay the next day, November 1st.
And what happened next, according to these sources, is it's truly tragic.
Yeah.
Almost right after being caught, bubbles apparently started coming from the harpoon wound on Shamu's mother. She started swimming erratically, and then, the sources say, she drowned the day after being netted, leaving the young Shamu completely alone.
It's devastating. Shamu was then moved to this net pen in Puget Sound, where Namu was being kept for the winter. But here's an interesting bit. According to Griffin, the two whales just did not get along.
Really?
Yeah, he actually described Shamu as rough. Said she was much harder to train than other whales he'd worked with.
So despite all that effort to capture her, she was put up for sale pretty quickly then.
Seems like it. Sold to SeaWorld San Diego for $75,000. SeaWorld had only opened the year before, 1964, and they were clearly eager to get a killer whale.
And the name. They couldn't use Namu because Griffin had the copyright, right?
Exactly. So they came up with Shamu. The sources suggest it meant either a friend of Namu or maybe she-Namu, and pronounced Shamu.
Shamu, got it.
Yeah.
And her arrival at SeaWorld, it marked some really significant firsts based on these sources.
Yeah, quite a few.
First killer whale ever owned by SeaWorld.
Check.
First killer whale intentionally captured specifically for live display.
Check again. A big one.
And the first killer whale ever to travel by airplane.
Quite the list for one young whale. She arrived down in San Diego on December 20th, 1965.
So her initial home there, it was a pretty small pool near the Dolphin Lagoon, the sources say.
That's right. Until eventually she moved into that brand new, much larger killer whale stadium.
Yeah.
Completed in 1971, cost $1.5 million back then.
Which was a lot of money.
A huge amount. Early on, there's a sweet detail in the sources. She was kept with a Pacific white-sided dolphin named George. And she apparently learned to perform quite quickly, did a lot of water work with trainers. She even starred in an early show called Shamu Goes Hollywood.
Shamu Goes Hollywood. Okay.
Yeah.
But she wasn't the only orca there for long, was she?
No, not at all. In 1967, two male southern residents from Cape Cod, Ramu, and Kilroy, they were brought to the park.
Okay.
Although the sources do note that Kilroy was really young, so he might not have been housed right with her immediately. There's some photo evidence that seems to back that up for 67, 68. But by 1969, it looks like he probably joined her. Ramu, the other male, he initially stayed in the smaller dolphin pool, only moved into the big stadium with Shamu and Kilroy in 1971 when it opened.
And there was another female, too, Kandu.
Yes, Kandu. She was captured along with Ramu and Kilroy, arrived in December 69. But the sources, they're a bit fuzzy on whether she and Shamu actually ever met before. Kandu sadly passed away in February 1971.
There's another fascinating, kind of worrying detail the sources mentioned. In January 1969, all three orcas there at the time, Shamu, Ramu, and Kilroy, they caught the Hong Kong flu.
Yeah, the H3N2 virus. Can you imagine?
No. What were the symptoms?
Well, the sources list things like poor appetite, weakness, sniffles, just general aching. It's like the flu in humans, really.
And the treatment sounds intense.
Oh, yeah. 375 tetracycline antibiotic pills every single day.
Wow. But they recovered.
Thankfully, yes. All three pulled through.
Okay, well, that's good. Now, we kind of have to talk about a very specific and, well, pretty infamous incident that happened during her time at SeaWorld.
Right. This one really stands out in the sources. It happened April 19th, 1971. It was meant to be like a publicity stunt. Involved a 22-year-old park secretary, Annette Eckes.
Yeah.
The plan was for her to ride on Shamu's back wearing a bikini, for photos and cameras.
But the sources mentioned there might have been warning signs.
Yeah, apparently trainers noticed Shamu's tail fluttering beforehand, which is described as a sign of agitation.
Okay, so not ideal conditions for a stunt.
Not at all. So the ride starts, Eckes completes one lap, and then she slipped off Shamu's back.
And that's when?
That's when it happened. Shamu bit down on her leg and significantly wouldn't let go.
Oh my gosh, how did they get her off?
The sources say trainers had to physically use a pole to pry Shamu's mouth open.
Wow. And Annette Eckes.
The aftermath for her was pretty severe. Ambulance to the hospital. The sources say anywhere from 100 to 200 stitches needed. And understandably, left with both mental and physical scars.
That's terrible. Do the sources offer any reasons why Shamu might have reacted that way?
They suggest a couple of possibilities. One main theory is that the bikini might have confused her.
How so?
Well, her conditioning, her training for water work, it always involved trainers wearing wetsuits. The bikini was something totally different visually.
That makes sense.
And it's also pointed out that Shamu had apparently acted aggressively towards people in regular swimsuits before this incident, at least twice.
Really? Like who?
Once towards a Catalina swimsuit model during a photo shoot, and another time towards a SeaWorld trainer also wearing a swimsuit.
So a pattern, maybe?
Possibly. One source also adds she'd been showing some erratic behavior since March of that year leading up to this April incident, so maybe a combination of factors.
It's clear from the sources that her time in captivity, while definitely impactful for the park, it was also pretty short overall.
Yeah, tragically short. She passed away on August 29th, 1971. Right there at SeaWorld San Diego, only about 10 years old.
And the sources mentioned something else significant happened before her death.
Yes, at some point she became pregnant.
And the father, given who was there.
Almost certainly Ramu. He was the only male orca at the park mature enough to breed at that time.
Okay. And the cause of death listed in the sources.
It's listed as septicemia and pyometra.
Can you break that down based on the source info?
Sure. So pyometra, it's described as a really serious uterine infection, often life-threatening. It's frequently linked to hormonal changes, especially involving progesterone.
Right.
During pregnancy, increased progesterone causes the uterine lining to thicken. This can create an environment where bacteria just thrive, leading to this dangerous buildup of pus inside the uterus.
And the septicemia part.
That happens when the bacteria from that infected uterus get into the bloodstream, which then triggers, widespread inflammation, organ failure. It's systemic.
It's awful. And her unborn calf.
Died with her. A double tragedy.
And SeaWorld's response, according to the sources.
The show's just continued, almost immediately. Kilroy, the other orca, apparently stepped in as her understudy.
Wow. But, the story of the original Shamu, it didn't really end with her death in 71, did it?
Not at all. Her name, Shamu, it just took on this whole other life, an incredibly lasting legacy.
It became the trademark stage name, right? For all of SeaWorld's killer whales after her.
Exactly. Maybe unexpectedly, but that's what happened.
And that name was just everywhere.
Everywhere, throughout the parks, obviously, on all sorts of merchandise, in the show titles themselves.
Like Shamu Goes Hollywood that you mentioned, Shamu Rocks America, the Shamu Adventure.
Right. Even the stadiums for decades were called Shamu Stadium. And it went beyond the parks, video games like Shamu's Deep Sea Adventure.
And they even used baby Shamu for the young ones born there, like Kalina and Orchid.
They did, really cementing that name across generations of captive orcas.
There's an interesting detail in the sources, too, about the gender.
Oh, yeah. The original Shamu was female, obviously.
Right.
But the Shamu character, the brand, was often depicted as male, referred to with male pronouns in marketing and stuff.
Huh. Interesting disconnect.
It is. And while SeaWorld has reportedly tried to, distance itself from the name more recently, the sources are clear. The name Shamu just stuck.
Yeah, it's absolutely synonymous with captive orcas for so many people.
Totally. And maybe the biggest point the sources make about her legacy, SeaWorld's acquisition of her, this specific whale, it essentially kickstarted a major industry.
That's a huge statement.
It is. But think about it. In the decades after her capture, hundreds of killer whales ended up in captivity around the world.
And SeaWorld itself kept acquiring whales, right? Through more wild captures initially, and then later through captive breeding for 50 years or so.
Yeah, over 5 decades. Though the sources do make sure to note that SeaWorld did end its killer whale breeding program back in March 2016.
Okay. Looking back at her personality, just summing up what the sources say, her original captor, Griffin, found her rough, difficult.
Right, compared to Namu, anyway.
But then at SeaWorld, she became known as a good performer, did well with the water work with trainers.
Yeah, but the sources also consistently mention that her behavior could still be erratic, unpredictable at times. Especially that specific dislike she seemed to have for ordinary bathing suits, which, connects back directly to that terrible incident with Annette Eckes.
Right. And just quickly, appearance details from the sources.
They mentioned she had a large, sort of oval-shaped body, a very round, prominent melon, that's the forehead area, long circular eye patches, and her dorsal fin, while tall, eventually developed a lean over to her right side.
Okay. So, pulling all this together, what have we really learned from this deep dive, just based on these wiki sources about the original Shamu?
Well, we've traced her documented journey, haven't we?
Yeah.
From her likely early life in the wild, that family pod, through the really dramatic capture, her short but very eventful life at SeaWorld San Diego, dealing with illness, the challenges, that major incident.
And ultimately her tragic death connected to that pregnancy complication.
Yeah.
So young.
Exactly. And maybe the most powerful takeaway is how her name just completely transcended her actual life.
Right. Became this enduring trademark, shaped a whole industry, became the face of captive killer whales for decades.
It's just one life story, really only about 10 years long in total. But look at the massive rippling consequences.
So for you listening, you now have, hopefully, a much deeper understanding of the individual whale behind that name you know so well. The name associated with marine parks and captive wildlife.
It really does make you pause and think, doesn't it?
It certainly does. And maybe here's a final thought to leave you with. How can the life and death of just one animal captured more than 50 years ago still be shaping public perception today? Still sparking debates about animal welfare, conservation, casting such a long shadow.
Yeah, what does this one singular story tell us about the power of individual lives, even non-human ones, to really influence history? And, the lasting impact of decisions that were made decades and decades ago.
That's definitely something worth thinking about.